On the morning of April 6th, 1930, an old man in a simple white cloth knelt down on a wet beach in western India and picked up a small lump of crusted mud and seawater. He had walked 240 miles to do it. Behind him trailed thousands of followers, and behind them, the eyes of the entire world. The crowd fell silent, and then, with the most ordinary gesture imaginable, Mahatma Gandhi lifted that pinch of natural salt from the sand and held it up to the sun. It was, technically, a crime. For under British law, no Indian was allowed to gather salt from their own coastline. Not from the sea that had given it freely for 10,000 years. Salt could only be bought, taxed, and sold by the British Crown. A grain of it taken from the open beach was an act of theft against an empire that ruled a fifth of the human race. And so when Gandhi raised that fistful of dirty salt, he was not just breaking a law. He was striking at the foundation of imperial power itself with the cheapest, humblest substance on earth. Tens of thousands were arrested in the months that followed. Gandhi himself was thrown in prison, but the image had already done its work. A great empire had been made to look ridiculous, threatened not by armies or guns, but by a man and a handful of salt. That was 1930. But the story of salt begins long, long before any empire ever thought to tax it. To understand why a pinch of it could shake the British Raj, you have to go back, past the kings and the caravans, past the very first cities, to a simple, brutal truth about what it means to be alive. Because here's the thing about salt that we have almost entirely forgotten. We cannot live without it. Not metaphorically, literally. Every beat of your heart, every thought crossing your mind right now, every flex of every muscle in your body depends on a thin electric tide of sodium and chloride moving across your cells. Inside you, at this very moment, there are roughly 250 grams of salt, dissolved in your blood, your sweat, your tears. We carry the chemistry of the ancient ocean inside us, and we have to keep topping it up, because we are always leaking it away. For most animals, this is no problem. A lion gets all the salt it needs from the blood and flesh of its prey. But the moment our ancestors began to settle down, to farm grain and eat plants, they ran into a quiet crisis. A diet of wheat and vegetables does not carry enough salt to keep a human body running. And so, across the entire ancient world, wherever people stopped wandering and started planting, they were seized by the same desperate hunger. They needed salt. They needed it the way they needed water, and they would do almost anything to get it. This is the secret engine beneath thousands of years of history. Not gold, not spices, salt. The one mineral that every single human being, rich or poor, had to consume to survive, and which most of the world found maddeningly hard to obtain. But where does it actually come from, this substance we crave? The answer is stranger and grander than you might think. Almost all the salt on Earth is the ghost of an ocean that no longer exists. Hundreds of millions of years ago, ancient seas spread across what are now dry continents, and when those seas evaporated under a prehistoric sun, they left behind vast beds of crystallized salt, sometimes hundreds of meters thick. Time buried them under layers of rock, and so, locked deep beneath places that have not seen the ocean in 100 million years, there lie entire underground mountains of salt, the fossilized memory of vanished seas. When we mine rock salt today, we are quite literally harvesting an ocean that dried up before the dinosaurs walked the earth. The earliest people, of course, gathered it the easy ways first. They scraped white crusts from the edges of dry lakes. They followed animals to salt licks. Along warm coastlines, they trapped seawater in shallow pools and let the sun boil it down to glittering crystals, the way salt farmers in places like Guérande in France and the lagoons of Portugal still do today, raking the bright flakes by hand exactly as their ancestors did 1,000 years ago. But the most astonishing salt came from underground. In the mountains of Austria, near a town now called Hallstatt, there is a place where, more than 7,000 years ago, people began to dig. Deep into the rock they tunneled, by torchlight, chasing veins of rock salt left behind by an ocean that had dried up hundreds of millions of years before. They hacked it out with bronze picks, hauled it up in leather sacks, and grew so rich on it that an entire prehistoric European culture is named after that single salt mine. The very name tells the story. In the old language, Hall meant salt, Hallstatt, Hallen, Halle. Across the map of Europe, the word for salt is hidden inside the names of the towns that grew wealthy mining it. Even Salzburg, the city of Mozart, means, quite simply, salt fortress, and the bodies of those ancient miners are still down there. The salt preserved them. Centuries-old corpses have been found in the Austrian mines, their skin, their clothing, even the contents of their stomachs intact, pickled by the very mineral they died trying to extract. Salt, you see, does not just flavor, it preserves, it stops time, and that single property would change the fate of the human species. The ancient Egyptians understood this better than anyone. To them, salt was not only food, it was the key to eternity itself. When they set out to mummify their dead, to preserve a body for the journey into the afterlife, the secret ingredient was a kind of natural salt called natron, gathered from the dried beds of desert lakes. They packed the bodies of pharaohs in it and left them for 40 days, and the salt drew out every trace of moisture, halting decay, holding death itself at bay. The reason we can still gaze upon the faces of kings who died more than 3,000 years ago is, quite simply, salt. The same mineral that cured a fisherman's catch also made mortals into something close to immortal. Now imagine what it meant to a community to be near a reliable source of this stuff. It was the difference between a settlement and a graveyard. Wherever salt could be found, people gathered, and where people gathered, towns grew, and where towns grew, the first threads of civilization were spun. Some of the oldest known settlements in Europe sit on top of salt springs. In what is now Romania, archaeologists have found evidence that people were boiling salty spring water to extract the crystals more than 8,000 years ago, making it one of the oldest such operations anywhere on Earth. We did not just stumble onto salt. We organized our entire existence around it. And once a society had salt, it had something even more profound. It had a future it could plan for. A people who could preserve food could survive a bad harvest, a long siege, a brutal winter. They could store wealth in a way that did not rot. Salt was, in a very real sense, one of humanity's first great technologies for cheating death, and like every powerful technology, it would soon be hoarded, fought over, and sold. Because before refrigeration, before canning, before any of the conveniences we take for granted, food rotted. A fisherman could haul in 1,000 fish and watch them spoil within a day. A farmer could slaughter a pig in autumn and have nothing left by midwinter. Hunger was not an accident. It was a season. And the only thing standing between a community and starvation through the cold, barren months was salt. Rub salt into meat, and the moisture is drawn out. The bacteria that cause rot cannot survive in that dry, briny world. Suddenly, a fish caught in summer could feed a family in February. A pig killed in November could last until spring. Salt meant ham, bacon, salt cod, pickled herring. It meant survival. And it meant that for the first time, food could be stored, stockpiled, and carried far from where it was caught. Armies could march on salted rations. Ships could sail for months across open ocean. Salt did not just keep people alive through winter. It made exploration, war, and empire possible. And the moment something becomes essential to survival, it becomes power. Whoever controls the salt controls the people, and rulers all over the world understood this with chilling clarity. In ancient China, more than 2,000 years ago, a statesman named Guanzhong looked at his ruler's empty treasury and had an idea of breathtaking cunning. Why tax the people directly, he reasoned, and make them hate you, when you can simply tax the one thing they cannot live without? He placed salt under state monopoly. Every grain, controlled by the government. The people barely noticed the price hidden in their daily bread, but the revenue was colossal. That salt monopoly would help fund Chinese dynasties for more than 2,000 years. It paid for armies. It is said to have helped build the Great Wall itself. An entire civilization financed by the human craving for salt. And the Chinese did not just tax salt. They chased it into the earth with a feat of engineering that frankly should be far more famous than it is. In the region of Sichuan, far from any ocean, ancient Chinese workers discovered that there was salt locked deep underground, dissolved in brine far below their feet. So they began to drill. Not with modern machines, but by hand, raising and dropping a heavy iron bit on a rope of woven bamboo over and over and over, pulverizing the rock inch by agonizing inch. It could take years, even generations, to complete a single well, and they went deep. By around 1,000 years ago, they were reaching hundreds of meters down, and eventually, at the great salt town of Zigong, they sank a borehole more than a kilometer into the earth, the deepest in the world at the time. As they drilled, they sometimes struck pockets of natural gas, and rather than fear it, they harnessed it, piping the flame through hollow bamboo to boil the brine they hauled up and crystallize the salt. Bamboo pipelines, gas-fired furnaces, kilometer-deep boreholes, all in the pursuit of salt, centuries before the rest of the world would even dream of such things. That is how badly humanity wanted this mineral. We were willing to dig a hole into the very bones of the planet to get it. The Romans understood it too. They built one of their oldest and most important roads, the Via Salaria, the Salt Road, to carry the precious mineral from the coastal flats up into the heart of the city. And there is a famous story, one you have probably heard, that Roman soldiers were paid in salt, and that this is where we get the word salary, from the Latin sal. Now, historians debate the details of this. It is more likely that soldiers were paid in coin specifically to buy salt, or given a salt allowance, rather than handed sacks of the stuff. But the linguistic fingerprint is real, and it is everywhere. Salary comes from salt. When we say someone is worth their salt, we are echoing a world in which salt was wealth, plain and simple. And the word salad comes from the Roman habit of salting their leafy vegetables. The traces of salt's old power are sitting right there in the words we speak every day, and we never even notice. Nowhere was that power more spectacular than across the vast, burning emptiness of the Sahara Desert. For in West Africa, a strange and beautiful reversal took place. There, gold was relatively plentiful, but salt was desperately scarce. And so, along the great trade routes of the medieval Sahara, men did something that sounds almost like a fairy tale. They traded salt for gold, weight for weight. A block of salt could be worth its exact weight in gleaming gold. Picture the caravans. Thousands of camels, sometimes tens of thousands, roped together in a line that stretched beyond the horizon, plodding across a sea of sand where the daytime heat could kill a man in hours. At a desolate place called Tahaza, deep in the desert, there was a settlement where the buildings, the very walls and rooftops, were built out of slabs of salt, because there was nothing else there but salt and misery. Enslaved laborers cut it from the ground in great gray blocks, and the caravans hauled it south, hundreds of scorching miles, to the fabled markets of Timbuktu and the Empire of Mali. This was the trade that made Mali one of the richest empires the world had ever seen. Its emperor, Mansa Musa, became so wealthy from the gold and salt flowing through his lands that when he made his pilgrimage to Mecca in the 14th century, he gave away so much gold along the way that he accidentally crashed the economy of Egypt for years. He is, by some measures, the richest human being who has ever lived, and his fortune flowed in part from the human hunger for a mineral that we now sprinkle thoughtlessly from a shaker and never think about again. Across the water in Europe, salt was building fortunes of a different kind. The shining city of Venice, that jewel of marble and water, did not begin with art or glass. It began with salt, harvested from its lagoons and traded with ruthless skill across the Mediterranean. the foundation of the wealth that would later buy all those palaces. To the north, in the cold gray waters of the Baltic and the North Sea, an entire commercial empire, the Hanseatic League, rose to power on the back of salted herring and salt cod, feeding the masses of Europe through Lent and winter. The hunt for fish to salt and for new fishing grounds to exploit pushed European sailors further and further out into the Atlantic and helped set in motion the age of exploration itself. And here is a thought that does not often get its due. The great voyages of discovery, the ships that crossed unknown oceans and redrew the map of the world, were only possible because of salt. A crew could not survive months at sea on fresh food. It would rot long before they sighted land. What filled the holds of those ships, what fed the sailors of Columbus and Magellan and all the others, was salted meat and salted fish, barrels of it, food made immortal by salt. The cod fishery off the coast of Newfoundland became so fabulously rich that fishermen from across Europe sailed to it for centuries, salting their catch on the spot and carrying it home to a hungry continent. Salt cod fed armies, navies, and entire nations. Without the humble grain of salt, the age of exploration, the building of overseas empires, the very connecting of the continents, might never have happened at all. We tend to credit the compass and the sail. We should also credit the salt barrel and the hold. But where there is power, there is also resentment. And the salt tax, that quiet, invisible levy on survival, became one of the most hated instruments of oppression in all of history. In France, they called it the gabelle. It was a salt tax of monstrous cruelty and absurdity. Not only was salt taxed at crushing rates, but in many regions, every person over the age of 8 was required by law to buy a fixed minimum amount of heavily taxed salt every single year, whether they needed it or not. The price varied wildly from one province to the next, which meant smuggling was inevitable, and the punishments for smuggling were savage. Thousands were imprisoned, sent to the galleys, even executed for the crime of moving salt across an invisible line. The gabelle was so despised, so symbolic of a corrupt and pitiless ruling class that when the French Revolution finally exploded, the hatred of the salt tax was woven right through it. The gabelle was abolished in the fury of the Revolution, a small mineral grievance feeding one of history's great upheavals. And it would happen again. On the other side of the world, in that moment we began with. When the British ruled India, they too seized control of salt, forbidding the people of an entire subcontinent, surrounded by salt water, from making their own. They taxed it heavily and punished anyone who defied them. And it was precisely because salt was so humble, so universal, so obviously a gift of nature that belonged to everyone, that Gandhi chose it. He understood, as Guanzhong and the Roman emperors and the French kings had understood, that salt is power. But he turned the logic inside out. If controlling salt was the proof of empire, then taking it freely from the sea was the proof of freedom. And so he walked to the ocean, and he reached down and he picked it up. Salt could even decide the outcome of wars. Consider the American Civil War. We remember it for its great battles and its generals, but one of the quiet, grinding struggles beneath it all was a war over salt. The Confederate South, cut off by the Union naval blockade, faced a desperate shortage. Without salt, they could not preserve the meat needed to feed their armies in the field. Salt became a strategic resource as vital as gunpowder. Its price soared. Families dug up the dirt floors of their smokehouses, where years of salted meat had dripped, and boiled the soil to recover the precious crystals. The Union understood this perfectly. Northern forces deliberately targeted Southern salt works, and the town of Saltville in Virginia, with its great brine springs, became the site of pitched fighting, precisely because of what bubbled up out of its ground. An army, it turns out, marches not only on its stomach, but on the salt that keeps its rations from rotting. Up in the north, salt was building cities. In central New York State, the brine springs around a place called Syracuse poured out so much salt that the town earned the nickname the Salt City. For decades, Syracuse salt helped feed and preserve a growing nation, and the wealth it generated helped pay for one of the great engineering feats of the age, the Erie Canal, sometimes wryly called the ditch that salt built. And across the Atlantic, beneath the green fields of Cheshire in England, lay some of the richest rock salt deposits in the world, vast underground seams that would help power the salt industry of an empire. Time and again, across continent after continent, the same pattern repeats. Follow the salt, and you find the money, the power, and the cities that rose around them. And it ran deeper than economics. Salt sank into the very soul of human culture. We speak of the most honest, dependable people as the salt of the earth. We still feel a flicker of unease when we spill salt at the table, an echo of an age when wasting something so precious felt like inviting bad luck, a superstition so old that some answered it by throwing a pinch over the left shoulder to ward off misfortune. In the ancient world, salt was so bound up with purity and permanence that it sealed sacred agreements. To share salt was to share a bond of trust and loyalty. Across religions and across continents, this single mineral came to stand for everything lasting, faithful, and true. That is how deep it ran. Salt was not just in our food. It was in our language, our beliefs, our very idea of what loyalty meant. For all of that drama, here is the strangest turn in the whole story. The thing that built empires and toppled them, the substance once traded for its weight in gold, became, in the span of a single century, almost worthless. It was industrial chemistry that did it. As humanity learned to mine and produce salt on an enormous scale, the price collapsed. The thing that had once been precious enough to pay an army became cheap enough to throw on an icy road. And throw it we do. Today, in cold countries, the single largest use of salt is not food at all. It is melting ice off winter highways, scattered by the truckload, millions of tons of it, vanishing into the slush every year. In fact, only a small fraction of the salt produced in the world now ends up on our tables. The vast majority of it feeds the chemical industry, where salt is the raw material for an astonishing range of products. Split it apart, and salt gives you chlorine and sodium hydroxide, two of the most important building blocks in all of manufacturing. From them come plastics like PVC, bleach, and disinfectants, the chlorine that keeps swimming pools and drinking water clean. Soap, paper, glass, dyes, the treatment of the very water that comes out of your tap. It has been claimed that salt has more than 14,000 distinct uses, and while you should take any such precise number with, fittingly, a grain of salt, the point stands. This single, simple compound is woven invisibly through almost everything in the modern world. The numbers are staggering. Humanity now produces somewhere in the region of 300 million tons of salt every single year. The substance our ancestors crossed deserts and fought wars to obtain, the substance worth its weight in gold, now sits in a paper canister in your kitchen cupboard, costing almost nothing, so ordinary that we have to be reminded that it was ever extraordinary at all. But cheapness is not the same as worthlessness, and this is where the story turns back on itself one final time. Because for all that we now treat salt as the most disposable thing in the kitchen, our bodies have never once gotten the message. To them, salt is still as precious as it was to a Neolithic farmer or a Saharan caravan, and that, in the end, is the deepest secret of the whole story. Think about why salt tastes so good. That is not an accident, and it is not simply learned. The pleasure you feel at the taste of salt is one of the basic flavors your tongue is built to detect, hardwired into you by evolution, because for almost all of human history, finding salt was a matter of life and death. Our ancestors who craved it, who sought it out, who could not get enough of it, were the ones who survived. The ones who were indifferent to it sickened and died. We are all descended from the salt cravers. That hunger you feel for a salty snack is not a modern weakness. It is the voice of 100,000 generations who needed salt to live, speaking through your taste buds. And the need is real and immediate. Lose too much salt through heavy sweating or illness, and the body falters fast. Muscles cramp. The mind grows confused. In extreme cases, the loss of sodium can be fatal within hours. This is why soldiers in brutal heat, athletes, laborers in the fields, have always known to replace their salt as well as their water. It is why, in the cruelest deserts and on the longest marches, salt was not a luxury. It was survival in crystalline form. The body is, in a sense, a small warm ocean, and salt is what keeps that ocean in balance. Let the balance slip too far, and everything stops. And yet strip all of that away, and the oldest truth remains. You still cannot live without it. Inside you, right now, that ancient tide of sodium is still rising and falling with every heartbeat, still carrying the faint chemical memory of the sea our distant ancestors crawled out of. We salt our food not merely out of habit, but out of a craving written into our flesh across hundreds of millions of years. When you taste salt and something in you says yes, more, that is not a preference. That is the ocean, calling to the ocean inside you. So think about that the next time you reach for the shaker without a second thought. That little white pile is the same substance that fed the dynasties of China and built the Great Wall. The same that preserved the pharaohs and carried them into eternity. The same that paid the legions of Rome and gave us the word salary. The same that was hauled across the Sahara, weight for weight, in exchange for gold, and made an African emperor the richest man who ever lived. The same that floated the palaces of Venice, fed Europe through 1,000 winters, lit the fuse of the French Revolution, and was lifted, one defiant pinch at a time, from an Indian beach to humble the greatest empire on earth. Kingdoms rose on it. Kingdoms fell because of it. Roads were built for it. Taxes were hated because of it. Deserts were crossed, and oceans were sailed in pursuit of it. And all the while, it was nothing more than a simple white crystal, a marriage of two elements, the residue of ancient seas. Not bad for the contents of a kitchen shaker, not bad for the cheapest thing on earth. If you enjoyed this journey through the strange and forgotten history of salt, take a moment to subscribe because we have many more stories like this one waiting for you. And before you go, tell me in the comments, which part of Salt's story surprised you the most? Was it the Saharan caravans trading it for gold, the salt-preserved bodies in the Austrian mines, or Gandhi humbling an empire with a single handful from the sea? Let me know below. And if this story changed the way you look at something as small as the salt on your table, do leave a like. It really does help. Thank you for watching, and I will see you in the next one.